Once again, what are we studying this week? Kierkegaard, Belief in a Secular Age. Dr. Rich Morrill. Morrill! I got it. Good to have you back. Thank you, sir. Got to get the name right.
Congratulations on being number one. We're number one in the CAA. It's a little tighter conference.
Here, I got it.
So today we've got some texts.
Does anybody need a handout for this?
Because we will probably
Just
work
a
on
reference text, one per family, or you didn't bring your copy? Anybody else need a? Just raise your hand and I'll pass it around. I heard that. I have one. There you go.
No, you want it? No. Okay.
So as we left Friedrich David Schleiermacher, we should probably put him into a little context with what comes next in Soren Kierkegaard's thought. As I said last week, Schleiermacher was a dominant influence on Protestant theology for a good 100 years in Europe, and certainly in some measure in this country. They're developed at the beginning of let's say, the second decade of the 20th century, in part triggered, I think, by the terrible events that had occurred in World War I and the suffering that induced on people and the kind of level of destructiveness and of human evil that was apparent, all the more manifested 20 years later when a genuine scourge of evil appeared in Europe in the form of the Nazi regime. That caused theologians to step back and say, wait a minute, in Schleiermacher we have someone, and a lot of other theologians like him, who seem to make it natural for human beings to be religious. So natural theology that occurs without the necessity for divine revelation and the grace of God, seems to be rather thin stuff, given the potential of human beings in their own corruption and the depth of their own alienation from God to make a terrible mess of things. And so, under the leadership of famed theologians like Karl Barth, the switch away from the kind of ease of knowing God through having a generalized feeling of dependence became much more the norm of theology. That goes under lots of names, but certainly one of them is neo-Orthodox theology, with a strong emphasis on the need for God's self-revelation before we can meaningfully talk about God's presence. And so Schleiermacher went into something of a decline in interest, but, like all things, by the 60s, people are starting to say, well, wait a minute, if you really read Schleiermacher closely, you understand that the feeling of absolute dependence is a kind of abstraction from the actual experience of the Christian religion. And he's simply trying to find this unchanging, tacit awareness that actually only comes to full flowering within the context of the Christian communion and with the actual religious emotions, or the religious affections of faith and hope and joy and love and gratitude and thanksgiving. And so he's pulled something out that really is embedded for the sake of his more systematic theological thinking. Interestingly, next time we get together, we'll be looking at H. Richard Nibor. His son, who has been, I think he's probably now retired, maybe 10 years ago, from Harvard, where he taught for years in the Harvard Divinity School, and was one of the thinkers who tried to, in effect, renew the thinking about Schleiermacher's contribution. And he makes the good point that when Schleiermacher puts together his systematic theology in the Christian faith, let's remember that a lot of what he's doing is simply organizing his theology the way it always had been. That is to say, you start with creation and then eventually you move to redemption. But in starting with creation, you're also already anticipating redemption. And so some of the thematic of redemption is impossible to remove really from the sections on creation. And every theologian has this problem of how in effect, to talk about creation when you already have been imbued with the thought patterns that come through God's revelation and God's grace. So that point was made by Richard Nibor and emphasized again when Schleiermacher is talking about absolute dependence as if it were kind of an unaided possibility for human beings to grasp fully. It's really partly just the way he organizes his theology. So now you would find actually Schleiermacher is, still has a place in current Christian thinking. As I suggested, there is this really good website at the Boston University School of Theology. Martin Luther King used to quote Schleiermacher. So there is a presence, a continuing presence of his influence. But it's also true that in the following generations of theologians, we see really important shifts in the primary lexicon of where theology starts. Whereas Schleiermacher very clearly tries to make Christian affections the starting point, from which you can then certainly move to the I think or the I know, because you have to develop your theology. And certainly an ethics is a prominent part of Schleiermacher's thinking as well. But here's the origin in the I feel. Today we make a very significant shift in a massively influential thinker, Soren Kierkegaard, who not only influenced subsequent theology in dramatic ways, but who also is often seen to be the father of the whole existentialist form of thinking in philosophy. And that influence passes from from Kierkegaard. It passes, if you will, in secular philosophy into thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, in his own way into a thinker like Camus, who never wanted to adopt the systematic philosophical reflections of a Sartre because they were always in some tension. Camus was much more of a literary than a philosophical figure in many ways, but there's no question that a lot of the motifs of Schleiermacher are picked up very clearly in a thinker like Camus, who uses the word absurd all the time, as we will discover Kierkegaard does. But in much of existentialist philosophy that becomes so prominent in the middle years of the 20th century, there is often a kind of relentless atheism. So a lot of the themes that have appeared in Kierkegaard in a religious context are shorn of their religious origin, and the particular themes that are so common in existentialist thought about forlornness, solitude, despair, self-choice, self-creation. You live by the decisions you make. You become the person that you choose to be through the values that you choose. All those existentialist themes really do begin in many ways with Kierkegaard. And yet, for Kierkegaard, the religiousness is powerful. Kierkegaard is essentially an orthodox thinker. He does not have problems with the received truths of the church. He works within them. Now, in working within them, he also, however, talks about ways in which those kinds of religious truths need to be appropriated into the form of one's life, to become a pattern of inwardness through the ways in which intentions, desires, form, if you will, a touchstone that is not exterior through reciting creeds or even, although he certainly follows the Bible assiduously, your faith is not in the Bible. Your faith is received through the Bible. But he's really intrigued with the question, how do we appropriate those truths? How do we embed those truths in the inwardness of our own existing? So the problematic then shifts away from the I feel to the I am. And suddenly, and this is sort of my own interpretation, I think it's right though, one of the central questions becomes worth. That is to say, for Schleiermacher, you feel God's presence in absolute dependence, and it's rather unproblematic. For Kierkegaard, as selves, as persons, with our self-awareness, the process and problem for our own existing as persons is often these inescapable doubts about our own worth. Yes?
I can't read that word under I am because the letter.
Worth.
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 Thank you.
So that it's not, the access to God is much harder in the ideas of Kierkegaard, because it does require a substantial reworking of the ways in which we define our own worth. That's why anxiety, that's why what he talks about is as despair, becomes such critical elements in his thinking. In other words, the gulf between God and man becomes much larger than what appears to be the relatively easy access to God by taking thought about where you come from. You do that with Kierkegaard as well, but the problem is when you try then to find God, you find there's a gulf, there's a distance that you can't close by yourself. And that's where the critical elements of revelation become so important. And that becomes a refrain that continues through contemporary theology in Reformed contexts. Even though, as I have suggested, there's a kind of fractured theological world, I would say that the idea that the problem of finding an adequate deity, finding something that you can believe in, is not entirely up to you, that there has to be an initiative in which God's presence is disclosed. So that's something of the shift in theological starting point that again occurs with this really influential Danish thinker. Now, Kierkegaard is fun in a lot of ways because he is really interesting and peculiar. I have a Kierkegaard collection, a few things which I brought, and every time you think you've got him pinned down, you sort of remember, oh yeah, but that was a pseudonymous work. Most of what Kierkegaard writes, he writes under a pseudonym, and he has a series of pseudonyms. And so one of his really, I think, important philosophical kinds of statements is presented with him as the editor and with the actual auditor being Johannes Climacus, which is an entirely invented name. There was a monk named Climacus in the early parts of the Christian era. It has nothing really to do with his thoughts. So Johannes Climacus is actually a kind of philosophical thinker verging toward Christianity, trying to figure it out. And in the concluding unscientific postscript by Kierkegaard, the author, Kierkegaard is editor, so he showed his hand, is reflecting on the questions that I've just offered, which have to do with the ways in which to understand the Christian faith, and the ways in which to understand what it means to be a Christian, and what it means to believe. And those themes would seem to be authentically Kierkegaard's own positions, because they crop up in lots of places. And then another of the important books, again, which we've put into your text for today, comes in, you can tell when this was bought, 1962 at Yale Divinity School, it says. And this is Fear and Trembling and the Sickness unto Death. And the author of this is, of course, Kierkegaard, but the pseudonym is Johannes Anticlimacus. So Johannes Anticlimacus is actually a Christian writer. And so he's working with, in Fear and Trembling, the phenomenon of faith, using one of his prime examples, the father of faith, Abraham. But Abraham happens, of course, to be willing to be a murderer. The worst kind of murder you could think of, in being willing to murder his son. Yes?
So why does Kierkegaard do that? Why does he write things under pseudonyms?
In part because he is a strange duck, and he enjoys the kind of, if you will, tension and drama that produces. And also, to keep people guessing, he's also a polemicist and gets into lots of hostile exchanges with literary figures and with church figures. And so he wants to kind of keep his cards to himself. All the while he has a very short life. He dies at, 42 or 3? And he's a solitary figure. He's a depressive person. His father was a wool merchant who started out as a shepherd, but got to know wool so well he became efficient in the market. And so Kierkegaard has this brooding home. He has, 6 brothers and sisters, and all but one die at very young ages. And so there is a deep melancholy in a lot of his psyche. And he, I think, tries to position himself so that he can get just the amount of attention he wants, but not too much. When he's writing some of these pseudonymous works, he's also writing more pure Christian works. The works of love, which is a reflection on the love commandment. In fancy terms, it's really a phenomenology of love. I mean, what is this phenomenon, and what are its roots, and what are its conditions? And he takes, love your neighbor as yourself, and says, by the way, let's take that through. That's not a feeling. That's a duty. And who is your neighbor? Your neighbor is obviously not the person living next door. Your neighbor is everyone. And he keeps on laying through the notions of Christian love, quite frankly, what are very meaningful and touching ways. And some of his devotional literature, which you don't see a lot of, it's not quickly and easily available, but as I've been poking around on the internet, I've found some sources, things I've never read before, and it's really very moving things. It's simple, it's almost childlike in some ways. There's a French fable writer, Jean de La Fontaine, who has these wonderful little fables, and when you're reading some of Kierkegaard in these devotional materials, it's a little like that, but it's touching. And so, toward the end of his life, he got into a huge conflict with the state church of Denmark, because he had become so persuaded that you really can't be born a Christian. You have to become one. And your life has to change. And it has to become this continuing process of interiority, in which the things you love, the things you bet your life on, are not the things of the world. And so the continuing reworking of ideas of worship, of service, of love, become for him tests of Christianity. And New Testament, early Christianity, is for him the model that the Church of Denmark should be following. And he sees in it hollowness, because it's just a question of passively reciting a creed, of mouthing a prayer, of getting a social position, and he finds it deadly. And he takes on the bishops and writes against the church. They get furious at him, and it goes back and forth with a lot of bitterness. So that's part of the process of this very peculiar fellow. He was engaged to a young woman named Regina Olsen, and he finally broke off the engagement because he thought, I am too melancholic to have a family. I will drag her down. But he did it by becoming so obnoxious in his behavior with the family that they finally said, "We don't want you." And so he felt better about things then, because he didn't have the courage to do it himself. And a lot of that kind of uncertainty of self works into his production. But, you know, let's have some fun. And if you could, I hope some of you do have a text, because there are some things here that seem to be, you know, really difficult, but that are very important. And so, you know, it might be fun, and I can read some of this, but if you have your text, this is on page 5. And, you know, this is getting to this question of the starting point for theology, the I am, the I exist. And so it starts out this way, toward the bottom of the page.
On page 1.
Page 5?
Page 5.
If you go to page 5, and this is really critical, where he says, a human being is spirit. But what is spirit? Spirit is the self. But what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself, or in the relations, relating itself to itself in the relation. The self is not the relation, but is the relations relating itself to itself. Got that? Okay. Now, think of Greek philosophy. The dominant ways of thinking about what distinguishes the human being. It is reason. Aristotle, Plato with a kind of capital R sometimes, because there's this evocative side of Plato as well. But the distinguishing characteristic is reason. And in addition to reason, of course, we can largely say there's also the sensuous element, the body, sensual experience, or sense experience. And so those are the two elements. You take body and soul, and you combine those. That's the relation. You combine body and soul, and you have a relation. And that's called the human being. Actually, Plato uses the word man. But since we're politically correct, we say that's the human being. So, a relation. What the Greeks had trouble doing is figuring out how that relation then has a relation to its own self. They talked about will somewhat, but they never knew quite what to do about will. I mean, there's a fairly clear doctrine in Aristotle, but in Plato that's not a very easy characteristic to follow. So the relation is there. The human being is this third thing, body, soul, human. What Kierkegaard comes along to say is, you've got the person, and you've got soul and body, and this, you know, this is the human. And Kierkegaard says, you have this relation, and then you've got the human, and this is a negative unity. It doesn't really do anything. The unity is a kind of passive unity. Kierkegaard says there is a relation that we would call the self, which becomes the positive unity of body and soul in our own self-awareness, in our own identities. So that through the process of the self's unifying body and soul, we have a new positive third thing. Any questions on that? So now the sphere of faith, the sphere of religion, is in this question of how the self finds adequate worth for itself. Because everyone lives in despair.
So does he put the human and the self in conflict with each
No, no. For him,
other? They're independent.
For him, human is just a passive word. It's just a word that the Greeks used to describe, that's man. When you would, and the dominant reality is soul or reason. And for Aristotle, how do you fulfill your human potential? You do so through maximizing the opportunities for contemplative reason. The fulfillment of the human person is rationality. And the more you can spend your time focusing on rational contemplation, reflection, the more you are human. Kierkegaard says, yeah, that's part of it, but the problem is humans are self-aware, and in the process of being self-aware, they're worried about their own validity, their own worth. I would suggest that if you read the Bible, you would find that that's probably a closer rendering of the spirit of biblical thought than the idea of reason as the dominant force. When Israel was a child, I loved her, and out of Egypt I called him. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more Israel went worshiping the Baal, the Baalim, the more I called him back. But I cannot give you up, O Ephraim. I reach you down with tender cords of love. That's not about reason. It's about relationship. And it's about finding an adequate source of relationship that unequivocally bestows worth on the self. Very deep.
So is self a perceived thing? I mean, is it something we do ourselves, or does it exist without any influence by our decisions that we make?
No, it is the reality that we all are continuously and forever living with, as we are, for example, in dialogue with ourselves.
So we don't do it ourselves. We don't make it up ourselves.
No.
It's not our perceived.
Well, some of it gets to be perceived, but Reinhold Niebuhr has this statement: humans are the only animals that talk to themselves. And we talk to
Not just me.
because we're forever saying to ourselves, did I do the right thing? Did I say the right words? Do I care about the right things? Why am I anxious about that? How come we are all living as if when that happens, we'll all be happy? You're thinking, the next promotion is going to get me where I really want to be. So, or, when I get the mortgage paid off, then I'm going to really start living. And when I, get some greater security about whether or not my grandkids are going to really be doing well in the world, finally I'll be able to think, yeah. So there's always this process of restlessness. Yeah.
Does Freud come in somewhere along in here?
Freud?
Freud, yes.
Freud would translate, we're going to talk about despair in a minute, and you will not feel in despair. But what Freud would do is want to psychologize despair and relate it to some kind of dislocation between your biological drives and socially approved norms. And that would really be a threat to the theology of Kierkegaard. If you could fully explain human despair as simply a psychological derangement or a psychological pathological problem, which it might appear, in fact, to be a real issue in the lives of many of us, then Kierkegaard would have to go away. Because everything would be explained by a scientific model. Freud is not exactly an empiricist, but he plays with empiricism. So now, this woman that at some point maybe we can talk about, maybe Marilynne Robinson, the great author, great novelist, also is a theorist. She's a reformed thinker. She's in a very active congregational church, I think, Church of Christ in Iowa. And she's written a lot of essays against the modern onslaught on inwardness. Inwardness being replaced by psychological interpretations that makes everything a question of therapy rather than, let's say, of sin. This is a therapeutic world in which we think we can answer the problems of the soul by a therapeutic category. The problem is our problem with our lives is we all have obsessions. And so, you talk to your therapist about your obsessions, and maybe there's a medication that will help. And that's all fine. But what Kierkegaard is saying is, no, the real human problematic is finding ourselves in their relationship to God. That's the real human problematic. And despair is that we actually are trying always to get rid of ourselves and concentrating upon an absolute relationship to finite things. It's living in the world and of the world. And that's the problematic. So, now that we have a self that really the Greeks didn't have in quite the same way, what happens then? Well, let's just turn the page and look on page 6. Now, it says, in the middle of the page, a despairing man is in despair over something. So it seems for an instant, but only for an instant, that same instant that the true despair manifests itself, or despair manifests itself in its true character. For in the fact that he despaired of something, he really despaired of himself, and now would be rid of himself. Thus, when the ambitious man, whose watchword was either Caesar or nothing, does not become Caesar, he is in despair thereat. But this signifies something else, namely, that precisely because he did not become Caesar, he cannot endure to be himself. So properly, he is not in despair over the fact that he did not become Caesar, but he is in despair over himself for the fact that he did not become Caesar. This self, which had he become Caesar, would have been to him a sheer delight, though in another sense equally in despair. This is now absolutely intolerable to him. In a profounder sense, it is not the fact that he did not become Caesar which is intolerable to him, but the self which did not become Caesar is the thing that is intolerable. Or more correctly, what is intolerable to him is that he cannot get rid of himself. So,
Which implies that there are two entities involved.
what are the two entities?
The self
Yeah.
and me. Because I'm arguing with myself, I don't like it.
Well, there are those two dimensions. There's the self taking itself as an object.
Yeah.
The self takes itself as an object, and in the process is unhappy because it is not what it wants to be. Now, this can play out in a million different ways. It doesn't have to be the ambitious man. The ambitious man may have, now again, this is in the 19th century, so this may sound a little sexist, but what Kierkegaard says is, well, there's also the sin of weakness, and that is that Caesar has a wife, and his wife really wants to be the wife of Caesar. Because in being the wife of Caesar, she can give up herself. She doesn't have to, she can define herself by saying, I am the wife of Caesar. I no longer have to worry about any other relationship. I no longer have to question where my worth comes from. I'm getting to be the wife of Caesar. Phew. I'm done with worrying about who I am. My identity is now fixed. So that constant sense of my worth, my value is deposited in one place. Now, let me just read you something. The idea that Kierkegaard sort of invented existentialism, may in some sense have some merit, but obviously, like all those categories, it's pretty partial, because there are some thinkers throughout Christian history who have very similar kinds of motifs. So, for example, who said this? I was in misery, and misery is the state of every soul overcome by friendship with mortal things. And I was lacerated when they were lost. And the soul then becomes aware of the misery, which is the actual condition even before it loses them. So we all become attached to mortal things. We lose them. We're lacerated. But we already knew that we were in misery. Who do you suppose said that?
Augustine.
Got it. Augustine.
Teachers.
And you will recall he also said, and we all learned this one time or another, you have made us for yourself, and we are restless until we find ourselves in thee. Now, and actually, the actual quote is, our heart is restless. And in the tradition, heart often gets used for self. Sometimes it gets used for feeling. But I would think you could submit that for St. Augustine, heart basically means self. And in the Confessions, he's wrestling with his true identity, and his true identity is with God. But, he's a bon vivant, he is a sensualist, and he discovers the emptiness of his sensual life. And that's where I think that first quote comes from. But there are other thinkers. A thinker, and this will give you a clue when I give you this in the language. There's another very important thinker in the 17th century who said, "Le cœur a sa raison, que la raison ne connaît point." Who said that? Le cœur a sa raison. Il faut traduire.
Pascal.
The heart has
Who's
its reason.
got it?
Pascal.
That's his wife.
Got it. The heart has its reasons that reason knows nothing of. The heart has its reasons that reason knows nothing of. Now, we got to be careful because that can sound like a pitch for emotionalism. And if I believe it, and this gets back to Kierkegaard, if I believe it deep down and have conviction and deep feeling about it, it's true. That's not what Pascal is saying. Pascal is saying that the heart, like the self, has its own defining needs. And reason, as a disengaged reason, doesn't understand that. So the heart would be the self. And again, I think probably very much present as an underlying theme in biblical narrative.
Don't all of these eventually lead you to believe that there was something before us that did all that?
Exactly. And for Schleiermacher, you can never penetrate beyond what the feeling of absolute dependence gives you. So you can never know what was going on way back then, because the really important thing is you know where you came from now. And Kierkegaard says something really similar. So, and he actually uses a term that's very much like Schleiermacher's. So if we continue in this vein, we come to this. After we've established the self, he then says, this formula that the self is constituted by another is the expression for the total dependence of the relation, the self, namely. The expression for the fact that the self cannot of itself attain and remain in equilibrium and rest by itself, but only by relating itself to that power which constituted the whole relation. So, very much like Pascal and Augustine, there is this notion of restlessness and of finding equilibrium that the self can't find by itself because it's always, in effect, in despair by itself, because the values that it believes in most deeply are transient, they're passing, they're flawed, they are not going to work. Yes?
So could anybody find their self, regain their worth without a God, a religion that elevates God in our lives?
Not for Kierkegaard.
Not for Kierkegaard.
Not for Kierkegaard. That would be, and he would say that when you find yourself, your real self, your true self, you find yourself in God.
Well, I experienced that, but it isn't very hopeful for people who are not religious, that they could have this wonderful healing experience and integrate themselves well.
You could probably find that there's an intentionality in persons of which they may not be conscious that is performing something on a less full scale than one would find in a relationship to God.
I see.
Because there is this constant process in which people are saying that's not enough.
Mm-hmm.
There's a yearning in the heart of human beings that seeks fulfillment. I think anyone would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care whether you believe in God or not. I think everyone would acknowledge through the literature, through philosophy, through art, through normal experience, there's always something more. You want the all. You want it all. And that all is a sense of utter and complete security, a worth that cannot be challenged.
Right.
And that's where then in Kierkegaard we find the notion of faith. And I just have to read this because, to be honest, I just love this. So Kierkegaard comes up with the idea that let's look at Abraham as the father of faith and the startling fact that in some categories he is a murderer or could be a murderer. So we turn to that thought, which is a very unsettling thought. So how can that be the father of faith? And he says, well, let's do a thought experiment. Let's think about the night of infinite resignation as one kind of faith and the night of faith. The night, K-N-I-G-H-T. The night of infinite resignation is someone who would be an ascetic. Let's think of a monastic life, quite literally in many cases. And you cut the nerve of attachment to the world. And you remove yourself from worldly engagement, literally. But there's another, the night of faith makes an additional movement. The night of faith cuts the nerve of attachment, but then re-enters the world and functions within the world. And that's Abraham. Abraham gives it all up. Everything the most precious you could conceive of, he gives it up. He gets it back through faith. The knife is shining in the moonlight or in the early sun. And then the ram appears in the bush. And through faith, Isaac is restored. So put that into the context of the night of faith, as Kierkegaard describes this in a literary form now. And we meet the night of faith. Here he is. The moment I set eyes on him, I instantly push him from me. I myself leap backwards. I clasp my hands and say half aloud, "Good Lord, is this the man? Is it really he? Why, he looks like a tax collector." I draw closer to him, watching his least movements, to see whether there might not be visible a little heterogeneous, fractional, telegraphic message from the infinite. A glance, a look, a gesture, a note of sadness, a smile, which betrayed the infinite in its heterogeneity with the finite. No, I examined his figure from tip to toe to see if there might not be a cranny through which the infinite was peering. No, he is solid through and through. His tread it is vigorous, belonging entirely to finiteness. No smartly dressed townsman who walks out to Fresburg on a Sunday afternoon, that's a park, I guess, near Copenhagen, treads the ground more firmly. He belongs entirely to the world, no Philistine more so. One can discover nothing of that aloof and superior nature whereby one recognizes the night of the infinite. He takes delight in everything, and wherever one sees him taking part in particular pleasure, he does it all with the persistence which is the mark of the earthly man whose soul is absorbed in such things. And yet, he lives as carefree as a ne'er-do-well, and he buys up at the acceptable time at the dearest price. And he does not do the least thing except by virtue of the absurd. And the absurd is, in giving it all up, he gets it all back, but in a different form. And yet, he has drained the cup of life's profound sadness. He has drained the cup of life's profound sadness. As he's walking home to have his beer and brains for dinner, if by chance his wife has not been able to secure that dinner, he's fine. He lives with that. He goes on. He is making continuously in his life resignation, acceptance, and finding then a double movement, because he's given it all up. That's not where he defines himself. That's not what ultimately he cares about. He gets it all back. So you live in the world, but not of the world. It's as simple as that. Errol.
Well, I thought of it this way. Probably read it somewhere, but see how you respond to this. The difference between the night of infinite resignation and the night of faith. The night of infinite resignation is someone who does it purely out of a sense of duty. He just has to do this in order to do the right thing. Like Agamemnon, who sacrificed his daughter out of a sense of duty.
He's the ethical hero. Agamemnon is the ethical hero. Right.
Whereas Abraham is the knight of faith. It's the teleological suspension of the ethical.
Right.
Because he never gives up hope.
Right.
That he won't have to sacrifice Isaac. He's willing to do it, and he even raises the knife. But even as he raises the knife to do so, he never gives up hope that God will find another way. And that makes him a knight of faith because he doesn't abandon the notion of hope, the hope in what is really the good and the right.
That's precisely Kierkegaard. And it's tough. I mean, inspect anyone's life, inspect your own life. I mean, who can do this? This is very hard stuff. If you read a lot of Kierkegaard's devotional literature and so forth, you see that this continuous effort at having some pain in this process of a life of faith. This is tough stuff. Yes.
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Got it. Yes, ma'am.
I hope this is not too stupid a question, but I have never before understood that Abraham didn't give up hope. I mean, is that in the Bible that he says, okay, Lord, I'm going to keep on hoping that you're going to provide a lamb, but I'm going to do it anyway? I just thought he...
No, he doesn't give up hope.
But
He does not give up hope.
it does say that.
How do you know? How do you know?
Where does it say? How do we know he didn't give up hope? I'm not trying to bug you, Errol. I'm just, you know.
The text is pretty spare.
The text is very spare, is my memory of it.
Yeah, the text is spare. But you can interpret that the reason that he persists, the reason that he does what he's going to do is that he has faith. And faith includes this dimension of hope. Yes?
Could it be that he's still looking for the ram, even as he's lifting the knife? I mean, that might be evidence of, I mean, even though he's getting ready to do the deed,
Right.
he still notices the ram.
There's some intentionality in his presence in the world, to put it in sort of existentialist language, that would suggest he knows that it will be restored to him. He knows that.
He says the Lord will provide when the son asks about the ram.
Right. That's right.
Well,
And
that's
that-
the Lord
and you
will
can-
provide.
Hopeful, I would think.
It'd be hopeful, or some people say, well, that's duplicitous. But no, but if it comes out of that sense that, you know, your validity is, or the worth in this relationship with God, everything I have in terms of my worth comes from God. Otherwise, Everything is transient and passive. Everything is defeated. So that's Abraham, and that's the faith that he is trying then to initiate in the people of Israel, who constantly are giving it up. They're chasing after wooden statues. They're chasing after gold rings. They're chasing after Baalim. And yet, then the refrain is always, I brought you out of Egypt. I brought you into the promised land. I made you a great nation. You're pretty puny. You're nothing. You're grasshoppers. What are you doing?
Yeah, and I think it's rather obvious the Bible sees Abraham as a hero of faith. So how could he possibly be a hero of faith if he's willing to murder his own son? And I think Kierkegaard is trying to explain that. Well, the only way to explain it is he's a man of hope. I mean, he didn't give up hope that God would find another way. That's why he's a hero. I mean, even though he's willing to do this, he also has hope. And hope is one of the most important emotions that we could possibly have. Without hope, we really are in despair.
Right. So listen, we're going to take this break next week, and then the following week, you have the papers available. We're looking for 2 weeks at 2 brothers, H. Richard Nibor and Reinhold Nibor. And I'll just tell you one quick story. When I was in my first year of studies at Divinity School, I had a close friend named Richard Dorn. He was a very close friend of my next door neighbor, who was a second-year student. Richard Dorn had been just married. He and his wife had lived apart for I think a year or 2 before they could get married. In those days, people didn't live together before they got married. In any case, he finally was reunited, and they married in the summer before they started at Yale. And by the middle of the year, Richard Dorn came down with a very horrible case of leukemia, and by the spring he was gone. And it was the most tragic thing in my life at that stage, and it was impossible. Richard Nibor was the advisor to this young man. And Richard Nibor wrote his wife a letter. And my other friend who lived on the hall, who knew the family before, brought the letter to my room, and he read it to me. Richard Nibor is not a biblical literalist, but his thought was deeply impregnated by all the language of the Bible. And it said, in our lives we'll experience continuously Good Fridays. And this is a terrible Good Friday. And yet we also know that Easter morning is coming. And so we live in hope. And the joy of the resurrection is the reality of God's presence to us at all times. That was a defining moment for me in getting interested in Richard Niebuhr's thought. And he's never written a huge systematic theology. He's written 7 or 8 books, many of which have been very influential. And so you'll have a chance to see how a very influential 20th century theologian, again in the Reformed tradition, synthesizes Schleiermacher, Kierkegaard, he's also very much a modern thinker in terms of his acceptance of scientific reasoning, his acceptance of biblical criticism, and tries to pull those together into an integration for, if you will, the 20th and 21st century. So have fun with that. And when you read Richard Nibor, there is, in the materials I gave you, there's an 8-page article that he wrote in 1941 that appeared in a Methodist magazine called Motive. It was written for college students. It's called Faith in God and in Faith in Gods and in God. And if you can read that, it's very accessible. You will get a whole bunch of understanding of how Niebuhr's thought works. And then we can talk about that when we get together after Thanksgiving. Thank you all for coming.